Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, as I am every week, Adam Lowther. And today we have a great guest. For those of you that may already know him, and there's probably a lot of you that do, Paul Saunders is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Center for the National Interest. He is an old-time Russia hand who has been looking at the U.S. Russian relationship for many, many years. And he's also involved in energy innovation, something that is a big topic right now and something the United States needs to look very carefully at. With that, and I got to say this, on a personal level, Paul, many, many moons ago, gave me an early chance to be involved at the Center for the National Interest and to have a DC presence. And for that, I will always be thankful. He's a great guy and one of the nicest folks I know. Paul, welcome to NucleCast.
Well, thank you, Adam, for that very generous introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Now, you have been watching the U.S. relationship for decades, and this sort of crazy evolution of a relationship from the Cold War to the Yeltsin era to the decades of Putin, Medved, Putin, and now we have the war in Ukraine. And so as you look at sort of where we are, where we've come from, and think through Russia's motivation behind the war in Ukraine. We've had a lot of explanations for it, but how do you see Putin thinking through invading Ukraine, the approach he's taken, and where he wants to go from here?
Well, in terms of the decision to invade Ukraine, there's been a lot of discussion of that, a lot of reporting on it. I think for Putin, there was kind of a steadily accumulating pile of grievances against the United States, mostly related to NATO enlargement and kind of frustration at American efforts to promote democracy and to intervene militarily around the world. Where Ukraine specifically was concerned, I think there was a kind of a growing worry on the part of Putin and some others around him about an increasing U.S. military relationship with Ukraine, that could ultimately lead to a U.S. military presence in the country. And I think from the perspective of Russian security policy, I think there were some concerns about that. Clearly the decision was taken on the basis of some very flawed assumptions about the capabilities of the Ukrainian military, the loyalties of the Ukrainian population, and kind of the stability politically of the Zelensky government in Ukraine. Because of that, as has become very obvious, I think Russia really failed in its initial objectives, recalibrated its objectives, failed to achieve those. From my perspective, I think Putin at this point has what I would call really a political strategy for victory rather than a military strategy, in which he can kind of afford to trade the lives of Russian military personnel and the sort of kilometers of Ukrainian territory that they have occupied in exchange for time. And he'll use the time to try to wait out the United States and its European allies, and in the hope that Western unity will kind of erode and Ukraine will ultimately be on its own. And then at that time, Russia can achieve its military victory. Or perhaps won't need to, because Ukraine will give in.
Yeah, and they, we could, there will be an election, and perhaps, a pro-Russian party and president comes to power, and therefore they seek, resolution, and Putin has the opportunity to say, well, there's a new guy, so therefore let's settle this. That bad Zelensky guy, he's out. So it does seem time gives them opportunities to come up with a creative way to walk away from this. Now, I'm curious, as you've watched, now I, like many others, as somebody who looks at Russian nuclear forces over many years, was surprised at the poor performance of the Russian military, both the Air Force and the Army. And it wasn't one I expected, having sort of watched what they had done in Syria. You can dismiss, some of the mistakes of the Wagner group, and say, well, they weren't Russian forces. They weren't Spetsnaz. They weren't, regular army. They weren't rifle. So what do you attribute to this poor performance of the Russian military?
Look, I think there's a long list there, but I would start with the fact that it's clear that a lot of the commanders and troops on the ground didn't really know what they were actually doing. They thought they were participating in an exercise. They hadn't really planned for more than that. It's apparent that in many cases they hadn't really, packed. Individual soldiers, packing up their own sort of personal equipment and supplies, and also units, managing their supplies, that they weren't really sort of logistically prepared for what they were doing, because they didn't know in advance. I think that's a big part of what occurred was just the Russian leadership's decision on how to run that operation and who to tell. I think that the war in Syria, and for that matter, the seizure of Crimea in 2014, I think as military operations, those were just very different operations. And I think that the lessons that the Russians learned from those, kind of at the command level, and also the experience of the troops, I'm not sure that it really directly translated. I think that's another factor. And it's also clear in some of the reporting that's come out, and if you kind of follow these debates on Twitter, and there are a lot of really outstanding experts on Twitter who are following the Russian military very closely, it's clear that a number of the Russian military units were basically kind of faking their training. And they were reporting, to commanders that they were completing training exercises, when what was actually occurring is, commanders were writing up reports, and, they would sort of order the soldiers to go out into the training ground and take some pictures, and then attach that to the report. And, everybody in the military command thought that they had trained units, when in reality they didn't. So I think there are a lot of factors. I'm sure there are others, but I would kind of point initially to those as some of the important ones.
Now, that's one I actually haven't heard before, that they were faking the training. And, just as somebody who spent, most of his adult life either in uniform or as a DoD civil servant, I the idea of faking training is just something that, I find hard to believe that people would do it and then get away with it. And it sort of brings to mind the question, if that's something that's commonplace in the Russian military, what's wrong with the Russian military and what's going on, that's sort of a commonplace thing, in particular at a time when, the Russian military and Russian nuclear forces in particular are sort of what Putin is using to push this, or to push back against this eastward expansion of NATO. So the idea of having forces that are doing that is, somewhat worrying, for me at
Right.
least.
Well, those are. I mean, we're of course talking about different kinds of forces, and I would certainly have every hope that the strategic, rocket forces and others in that part of the Russian military are taking a different approach, and I don't see any kind of evidence, that they aren't training appropriately in that part of the Russian military. But I think the fundamental problem with the Russian military, and it's the same problem that the Russian government bureaucracy has, is that there are a lot of people who are afraid to report upward on shortcomings, and they don't want to face the consequences of doing that, so they don't. And I, personally would be very surprised, getting back to the question of the Russian military's poor performance, in Ukraine. I fully expect that in the sort of early days and weeks and possibly longer of that conflict, that every time a report moved up a level in the chain of command, that the number of Russian casualties was reduced by the officer who was reporting to superiors. And you can imagine, if you have, I don't know, 3-4 levels of reporting, but between people in the field and commanders in Moscow, how distorted your picture of what's occurring would become. So I think that this factor of kind of accuracy in reporting is one that we have to look pretty closely at too. I expect that has probably become less an issue over time, because I think that senior leadership would kind of increasingly figure out what was going on and take steps to have a clearer understanding of conditions. But I think that's something else we have to look at in this case.
Now, in a previous episode, we had Rebecca Koffler on, and she talked about the Russian regime and described it in a way as very similar to what we think of the mafia in the United States, and that it's this almost like a protection racket. And as long as Vladimir Putin is providing benefits to those beneath him, he'll maintain their support. But once he can't provide those benefits, then we should expect him to be taken out. Do you see the Russian regime in that light or in a different light? And then how do you think that if something like that, or, something equally sort of broken, is what the regime is, I often wonder how they can expect, quality performance in a conflict against a Ukraine that's, after Crimea was taken, the U.S. and U.S. Special Forces have been in Ukraine, training, equipping, supporting. So the Ukrainians in 2014 not so hot, but they had essentially 8 years to get better. And so I wonder how well, and we're seeing that on the battlefield, obviously, they'll do against this sort of broken regime with a broken military.
Look, I think as a government system, I'm always reluctant to make analogies because I think they can be sort of useful in some ways and misleading in others. So I'd be a little bit reluctant to sort of look too closely to the mafia as a model. But what I would say is that it's a system that's based very much on individual officials being powerful rather than government institutions being powerful, if you understand the distinction
Sure.
That I'm trying to make there. And I think that one consequence of that is that when officials, or particularly President Putin, focus on one specific thing, that they can be very effective in mobilizing people to do that one specific thing. And they can get the Russian bureaucracy and system kind of under control and make clear to people what the penalties are for not doing what they're supposed to do. But while they're focused on that one specific thing, they're not focused on other things. And because the institutions are weak, then there aren't good systems in place to make sure that other things keep happening while you're focused on the one specific thing. So I think that government can be effective in the areas where it concentrates effort. But in other areas, it often isn't. That there are also certainly, issues of official corruption, and we've seen that as a factor. Certainly in this conflict, it's clear that there are units that kind of weren't really supplied as well as they should have been. It's clear that there were kind of central stocks of certain things that weren't as large as in reality as they were on paper. And excuse me, there have been Russian officials who have been dismissed, and military officials, defense ministry officials who've been dismissed as a result of this. So, it's clear that Russia faces those kinds of challenges too.
Yeah, we're unfortunately, this is a great conversation. We're at that point of the show where we have to take a quick break. We're talking to Paul Saunders, and you're listening to NucleCast, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and you're listening to NucleCast, and we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Paul Saunders. He's been watching the Russians for decades, so he's pretty familiar with them. And, you bring up this issue of, we might call it a kleptocracy, bribes. I mean, Philip Short's new biography of Putin talks about, and, this was somewhat surprising. Initially, you see him almost appear empathetic to Putin. And then as Putin takes the presidency and then, takes power over time, you see almost a darker picture of Putin develop, in Short's biography. And I sort of wonder, there was a lot, for me at least, he fills in a lot of gaps in sort of my knowledge of the specific jobs Putin had and how he sort of rose to power. But I wonder if his portrayal of Putin as almost, a bureaucrat who wanted to perform, wanted the Russia to come out of the Soviet collapse, to become prosperous, to become wealthy. And he was by and large sort of a admirable character. And then he turns into this person who has people assassinated, who makes sure that he takes out anybody who might aspire to power. Is that, in your many years of looking at Russia and Putin and the state, is that sort of your take on Vladimir Putin as we think about, his past and then, of course, his future?
Well, I actually I wrote a review of that short biography, and I think it had a lot of strong points to it, and particularly in talking about Putin's early life and early career, I thought Short got access to a lot of interesting sources and people, and painted a really good portrait. It's a challenge writing a book like that, because over time, Putin becomes less and less accessible, and the people who are kind of close to him and working with him also become much less willing to share their perspectives, shall we say. So I think it's harder over time to write a book like that. I think one of the questions that I kind of ask myself in thinking about Putin is, he starts out certainly as a young person, as someone who is leading kind of a relatively ordinary, if not even a somewhat lower class by Soviet standards lifestyle. He's sort of one of the people, if you will. And I think during that time of his life, I kind of expect that he developed a fairly good read on, let's call them ordinary people in St. Petersburg, because
Sure.
Of course that's where he grew up. And, Russia is a really big country. The Soviet Union was even bigger, and not every place is the same as St. Petersburg. But I think he developed sort of a pretty good feel for that. But I kind of have to ask myself over time, as you have somebody who, in the late 1990s sort of becomes a senior official. In 1999, becomes prime minister, then he becomes acting president, then he becomes president. And, for the last almost 24 years here, he's been either prime minister or president of Russia, and sort of increasingly isolated, really. Even more so during the pandemic, when, from every available public source we see, he was requiring people to quarantine for 2 weeks before meeting him in person, and the number of people who were willing to do that, it was kind of very limited. So his sort of personal contact with other people was quite constrained. So I think you have to kind of ask yourself at a certain point, to what extent is he really still in touch with people in his country? And clearly there are, some of them who I think he understands fairly well, and there are others who might understand less well, and still others who he doesn't want to understand, and he would kind of prefer that they move to somebody else's country,
Yeah.
But
It's probably becoming harder and harder for him to understand how Russian society is changing over time.
well, look, I think it's harder for anybody. I will reveal. I'm 54. I used to be a lot younger, and there are some things that were easier for me to understand in our society when I was a younger person than they are for me to understand today, because our society is changing, and I'm part of a particular generation, right?
Sure.
And I think we always have to be aware of factors like that. Um, and in my case, I kind of hope I'm more connected to my society, than Putin is, and there are still things that I have a hard time understanding.
Let me, before, I'm looking at the clock and we're running out of time. And so I wanted to ask about this notion that, there's an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. They want to put him on trial for war crimes in the International Criminal Court. And as I've talked to some of my other compadres in the deterrence community, and who are also watching the war in Ukraine, and our take on this is that this is probably a mistake if we ever wanted to seek a resolution to the war. That, saying, hey, we're going to arrest you, if you leave your country. And there was a article that said he didn't attend an international meeting, I think last week, because of a fear that he might be arrested. That's a terrible way to make sure you ultimately reach a resolution to a conflict. Whereas others, there are others, I've read articles at the Atlantic Council and elsewhere that are, supportive of this move. And I'm curious as to your take on whether this is a good idea, bad idea, or the implications of it.
Sure, sure. Well, look, there are really profound moral questions here. And I think very few people would find Vladimir Putin, an attractive moral example, right?
Sure, absolutely.
So I think a lot of us would agree on that. I'm a foreign policy realist. And from the perspective of foreign policy realism, when I think about morality, I want an outcome that I believe is a moral outcome. And I'm kind of less concerned about how moral our intent is, or how moral our statements are. I want the results to be moral. So, kind of standing up and denouncing Vladimir Putin, or charging him in the International Criminal Court, or these other things, I understand why people feel that way. I understand why people want to say those things. It's not that I really particularly disagree in my evaluation of Putin's behavior. But I want to have an outcome in which, the smallest possible number of people die and are displaced, and suffer the other horrors that people have to suffer, of which there are very many, when you have a war underway. So that's kind of the standard that I use in thinking about, what's most moral in this conflict. And I really worry that creating a situation in which Vladimir Putin is personally isolated and has nowhere to turn, and his only hope is kind of to do whatever he can do to stay in power by any means necessary. I'm not sure that that's a pathway that leads us to, a more moral outcome using the standards, that I personally would apply in thinking about morality. Everybody, has their own way of thinking about morality. I respect that. But my standard of morality is, again, to have the fewest number of people, additional people, become victims of this conflict.
Now, we had Stephen Blank on a previous show, and one of the things that he said that sort of struck me was that he thought that Russia and Vladimir Putin had to launch this war now instead of in 5 years or 10 years because of this declining Russian population, the declining number of males, that there's this almost this bubble that is going to burst. And so he won't have sufficient manpower, in the future. And so now was the time for this. Is that sort of a good descriptor or?
Well, I think that Putin felt pressure to act now rather than later. I'm not sure that was really the main driver because, again, from my perspective, I think Putin didn't think he was going to fight a real war. He thought he was going to fight a 3-day war and take Kyiv, and Zelensky was going to run, and they would put somebody else in charge of Ukraine and it would be over. And in a scenario like that, whether you have like 200,000 troops or 250,000 troops or, I'm not sure that would be the sort of the fundamental deciding point. I think the time pressure was really coming more from the fact that Ukraine was getting sort of more and more integrated with the West, and more and more with the European Union economically, more and more kind of training and military training and other kinds of support coming from the West. And I think that there was a concern that it was just going to be, it was not exactly now or never, but that the cost was going to go up over time. This was kind of the time that made sense. That's how I would look at it. I mean, I do agree that I think that the Russian leadership, including Putin, felt that time was not on their side.
Sure.
So I certainly would agree with that kind of broad characterization.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. This is the great thing about a show that tries to stick to half an hour, is that you always leave folks wanting more. And you don't take up too terribly much of their time. So, it's a nice listen for a car ride. We try to time the show to be about the average length of a car ride into the office. And so hopefully we are able to do that every day. Paul Saunders, thanks for coming on Nuclecast. We appreciate it. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Adam. Love doing it. Great to see you. Good luck with the show.
And to all you, the listeners, thanks for listening to another episode of Nuclecast, and we will see you on the next episode. Well, a couple afterthoughts in our discussion with Paul Saunders. It's always, Paul's a well-thought, careful thinker who really puts a lot into trying to take a sort of a balanced approach to any of these topics. And so it's always good to hear what he has to say and hear his thoughts. And, he offered a couple of points there, that I hadn't heard before, particularly this messing with the record on training efforts and saying, hey, we've done this training, but they really hadn't. And therefore that came to play in the invasion of Ukraine. That was pretty interesting for me. I don't know what y'all thought about it, but that was something I had not heard. And, it was just good to hear Paul's thoughts. We've had Rebecca Koffler, we've had Steve Blank. And so to get these three folks who really know and understand Russia, and to see the variety of opinions that are really, while there may be some difference, there's not a ton of difference. There's the range of variation is fairly narrow. And so I think we've got a pretty good understanding of the Russian state and of Vladimir Putin. And so that's something I found really good and sort of valuable about this episode.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclearcast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.